Let's begin with what is perhaps the most challenging question about the American Revolution. Was it, as the essayist Adam Gopnik has argued, a fundamental mistake?
It's a deliberately provocative starting point.
Hmm.
It really forces you to step outside the usual triumphal narrative.
And Gopnik's argument is that the revolution was essentially a needless, brutal conflict.
Yes, his framing is that it was a mix of slaveholders' panic and what he calls Enlightenment argle-bargle.
Enlightenment argle bargle. That's a great phrase. What does he mean by that?
Well, it's his way of describing the dense political philosophizing of the era. He sees it as this intellectual noise, this focus on abstract rights that ultimately pushed practical men away from what could have been a more gradual, peaceful path to self-rule.
So, in his view, this violent path led to a nation that was, from its very inception, marked by violence and demagogy.
Exactly. The critique contrasts it with the models of, say, Canada or Australia,
Hmm.
places that evolved toward sovereignty without a bloody revolution.
And the really critical counterfactual he raises is slavery.
Right. If the colonies had stayed within the British Empire, is it possible slavery would have ended sooner and more peacefully, leading to a kind of social democratic commonwealth instead of what came later?
It's a powerful argument because it makes us confront the idea that 1776 wasn't some historical inevitability.
Absolutely. And if we accept that compromise was possible, you have to ask when that door really slammed shut. And most historians would point to the year 1778.
The global term.
The global turn. It's no longer just a colonial policing action. The French, seeking revenge for the 7 Years' War, formally commit to the American cause. That changes everything.
And Spain follows them in 1779.
So now Britain is facing a European war, waged across oceans, all while trying to manage this insurrection in North America. It stretched the Royal Navy and the British Treasury to, well, to the breaking point.
And it wasn't just France and Spain actively fighting them. There was a broader diplomatic effect, wasn't there?
A huge one. You get nations like Russia, Denmark, Prussia, Austria,
Mhm.
even Portugal. They all formed this League of Armed Neutrality.
What was the purpose of that league?
It was a direct response to British interference with their trade. They declared they would trade with anyone, including the Americans, and would use force to resist British ships searching them. So while they weren't fighting in America, they were adding enormous global pressure.
So the consensus is, once the French intervened, Britain's strategic options just narrowed dramatically.
They did. The original goal, the hardline goal of King George III to restore the pre-1775 status quo that was absolutely finished by 1778.
Some might argue the war was unwinnable from the start for Britain, just given the logistics.
That's a strong argument. But even if there were, narrow chances for a military victory earlier, by 1778, Britain was effectively fighting a world war.
And trying to do that while defending their truly valuable colonies, the Sugar Islands in the Caribbean.
Jamaica, Antigua, those are the economic engines. Defending them, and Great Britain itself, from a combined European fleet, made dedicating the necessary resources to the American mainland almost impossible. The whole military machine was just dangerously overstretched.
And this international pressure on Britain is happening at the exact moment of the lowest point for the American cause itself.
It is. We have to look at the crisis of 1777, 1778, that desperate moment at Valley Forge, and how it generated this powerful national mythology.
The British had just captured Philadelphia, the seat of Congress. Washington must have been in despair.
He was in a state of professional despondency. He leads his depleted, demoralized Continental Army into this winter encampment at Valley Forge, just northwest of the capital.
And the conditions there were horrific.
Truly desperate. You read contemporary accounts of the freezing cold, the lack of food, the soldiers in threadbare uniforms. They were building thousands of tiny, rough huts just to survive.
The risk wasn't just battle casualties at that point.
No, not at all. The primary political risk was the army simply dispersing. These were citizen soldiers on short enlistments. If Congress couldn't pay them, if the officers couldn't feed them, they would just go home.
And if the army dissolves, the revolution is over.
It is. The military resistance ends. You're forced back to the negotiating table on British terms. So the army's sheer survival through that winter was everything.
And that experience, Valley Forge, becomes central to American identity, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It reinforces the whole underdog narrative, the idea that this was a triumph against impossible odds, achieved through sheer endurance.
And later, it gets framed as a spiritual victory. You think of figures like Ronald Reagan talking about Washington kneeling in prayer in the snow.
Yes, seeking providence. The myth suggests the victory was a kind of divine validation. But the Army's actual physical survival Well, that was rooted in something much more practical. It was rooted in unrecognized, brutal logistical labor.
Much of it performed by women.
A great deal of it. The research now really emphasizes the hundreds of women who followed the Army. Not just prominent figures like Martha Washington, but countless others. Wives, laborers,
What
servants,
were they doing?
providing the infrastructure of survival. They were washing clothes, which was critical for stopping the spread of disease. They were bandaging wounds. And, crucially, they were helping to find, cook, and distribute what little food there was.
There's a wonderful description from Thomas Paine, who was there.
Yes, he compared the whole operation to a family of beavers. He said the men were doing the spectacular work, building forts, but the women were constantly, industriously laboring underneath it all just to keep the entire enterprise from collapsing.
It highlights that the war was ultimately won or lost based on the commitment of the civilian population, the sacrifices made at the household level.
It was. And that leads us directly to the very uneven outcomes of the revolution. Not everyone shared equally in the great boon of liberty.
Let's start with poor white men. For them, this was genuinely revolutionary.
It really was. You look at the new state constitutions, and Pennsylvania's is the most radical example.
How so?
It eliminated all property qualifications for voting
Yeah.
and, critically, for holding office.
That's a huge departure.
It's massive. This was a system that rivaled the most extreme democratic moments of the English Revolution in the 1640s. It gave real political power to ordinary, often propertyless, white men who had been completely excluded before.
But that wasn't the case everywhere. Virginia, for instance, was much more conservative.
Much more. The planter aristocracy there made sure to maintain property requirements. So this democratic energy was unleashed, but it was contained differently in different states.
And for women, despite their wartime contributions, the formal political gains were minimal.
Very mixed. We all know the famous exchange between Abigail and John Adams. She urges him to remember the ladies.
And his reply is quite condescending, isn't it?
It is. He dismisses it with a joke about the despotism of the petticoat. But what's fascinating is that he still valued her as a close political counselor. He was testing his ideas on her, relying on her political insights.
So there's this intellectual partnership behind the scenes, but it doesn't translate into formal political power.
Not really. The one exception, New Jersey briefly enfranchising some property-owning women in the 1790s, was almost an accident of wording, and it was quickly repealed.
The picture gets much, much darker when we turn to Native Americans.
For them, the revolution was an unequivocal disaster.
Before the war, policymakers in London often saw an advantage in balancing powerful indigenous nations against the colonists. The Proclamation of 1763, for example.
Exactly. It was a source of friction with the settlers, but it served the Crown's interest. American independence removed that external balancing force entirely.
And many Native American nations had allied with the British, believing they offered the best protection for their land.
They did, and after the war, they were regarded as having sided with the enemy. The practical effect was devastating. Native American peoples were now seen as, well, as essentially fair game within the boundaries of the new United States.
So for them, the revolution was clearly a bad thing.
Unquestionably, it ushered in decades of relentless pressure and displacement. And we see a similarly complex, contradictory picture when it comes to slavery.
How was the war both detrimental and beneficial to the anti-slavery cause?
Well, in the Deep South, the structures of slavery often became even tighter
Why was that?
because slaveholders perceived, often correctly, that enslaved people were siding with the British. This paranoia led to harsher slave codes and a much fiercer defense of human beings as property.
But the British were actively encouraging this. Lord Dunmore's proclamation in 1775.
That's the other side of the coin. Dunmore promised freedom to any enslaved person who would fight for the king. This led to the formation of units like the Ethiopian Regiment,
Black loyalists?
thousands of them, and they were critical to the British war effort as pilots, guides, and soldiers.
The most famous example is probably Harry Washington.
Owned by George Washington himself. Harry escaped, fought for the king for the entire war, and was successfully evacuated to Nova Scotia. His story, and thousands of others, gave rise to that powerful phrase, "Liberty wears a red coat,"
So for thousands of enslaved people, the British Army was the agent of freedom.
the most tangible one they had. So you have this intense duality. In the South, the war reinforces slavery. But in the northern states, New England, Philadelphia, the philosophy of the Revolution gives a massive boost to abolitionism.
The hypocrisy becomes too much to ignore.
It does. The language of natural rights, combined with a less central role for slavery in their economy, leads northern states to begin the process of gradual abolition almost immediately after the war. Both trends were happening at the same time.
So, after that low point at Valley Forge, the global nature of the conflict really begins to cause the British war effort to implode.
The pressure just becomes relentless. The Royal Navy is stretched thin, defending the Caribbean, protecting supply lines, and crucially defending the home islands.
The threat of an invasion of Britain itself was real.
Very real. You have the combined Franco-Spanish Armada of 1779. It ultimately failed to land troops, but the psychological impact was enormous. It forced Britain to divert ships and soldiers for home defense that could have been used in America.
And this is where figures like John Paul Jones become so important.
Yes, the American privateer. A complex man, a former slave ship captain. His job was simply to harass the British coast.
His raids, like shelling Whitehaven, weren't strategically decisive, were they?
Not in a military sense, but as propaganda, as a nuisance, they were a huge success. They forced the British to divert resources to defend their own coastline, something they hadn't had to do for generations.
It's amazing to think about his later life. An admiral for Catherine the Great in Russia, a rape accusation, dying in Paris just before becoming a U.S. consul.
An incredible, tumultuous life.
Yeah.
So with all this pressure, the question becomes, why did Britain keep fighting after 1780? Support for Lord North's government was clearly fading in Parliament.
Was it just pride?
Massive pride and royal stubbornness. For George III, acknowledging American independence was a monumental, humiliating loss.
And they still held out hope for a victory in the South.
They did. They had won major battles there, like at Camden.
Yeah.
And they believed, or hoped, that large pockets of loyalist support could still be activated to turn the tide.
Which brings us to perhaps the most famous turncoat in American history, Benedict Arnold.
Arnold was, by all accounts, a brilliant and brave general. But he was also prickly, ambitious, and deeply in debt.
He felt he wasn't getting the credit he deserved from the Continental Congress.
Exactly. He felt he was being passed over for promotion because of politics, and then he married Peggy Shippen from a prominent Loyalist family.
And the combination of debt, wounded pride, and his wife's influence pushed him to defect.
His plan was to surrender the fortress at West Point, the key to the Hudson River. It was an audacious act of treason.
The plot was discovered at the last minute. Arnold escaped, but his British contact, Major John Andre, was captured.
Yes, Andre was caught behind American lines with the plans. He was tried and executed by hanging as a spy, not by firing squad, which was considered the more honorable death for an officer.
And yet, even his American captors were impressed by him.
They were. He showed astonishing bravery and bearing right up to the end. It's a moment that shows the lingering cultural connection between the two sides.
On the complete other end of that spectrum of British officers, you have Banastre Tarleton.
Tarleton, the inspiration for the villain in The Patriot. He was known for his dash and gallantry in society, but for incredible brutality in the field, especially in the Carolinas.
His name became associated with Tarleton's Quarter.
Meaning, no quarter given. It comes from an incident where his men were accused of killing American soldiers who had already surrendered. Tarleton claimed his horse was shot, causing confusion, but the reputation for ruthlessness stuck.
Which raises a strategic question. Would more bloody Ben Tarletons have helped the British win through sheer terror?
The consensus is almost certainly no. It might win you skirmishes, but it destroys any hearts-in-mind strategy. It would only have entrenched American commitment and made any outcome other than total victory impossible for the Patriots to accept.
And this focus on the South is what ultimately leads to the climax of the war at Yorktown.
It does. And we have to talk about General Cornwallis. Despite his failure there, he was a very successful commander.
He was actually something of a paradox, wasn't he? A Whig who had opposed the Stamp Act in Parliament.
He was. And he had a very distinguished career after the war as Governor-General of India. But in 1781, his goal was to move north from the Carolinas into Virginia to cut rebel supply lines.
He was growing tired of the guerrilla warfare in the South.
He wrote that he was quite tired of marching about the country in quest of adventures. He wanted a secure, defensible position where he could be supplied by sea. So he chose Yorktown.
A peninsula. A choice that depended entirely on the Royal Navy controlling the sea.
And that proved to be a fatal miscalculation. Washington and the French army under Rochambeau converge on him by land. The French forces alone outnumbered him 2-1.
But the decisive move came at sea.
The French fleet sailed into the Chesapeake Bay, defeated the British relief fleet, and cut him off completely. He was trapped.
Add to that the swampy conditions, malaria, and constant bombardment.
His position was hopeless. On October 19th, 1781, he surrendered.
But he didn't attend the ceremony himself.
No, he claimed illness, a common courtesy to avoid the personal humiliation, and sent his second-in-command, General O'Hara.
And Washington responded with a pointed gesture of his own.
He did. He refused to accept the surrender from a subordinate. He had his second-in-command, General Lincoln, accept the sword. It was a deliberate layering of humiliation on top of defeat.
And the ceremony itself was designed to be humiliating for the British troops.
Very much so. An unsporting end. They had to march down a long gauntlet, throw down their muskets, furl their flags. A very bitter moment for them.
But then, immediately after, Washington's behavior shifts.
It's one of the great contradictions. He shows immense sporting behavior, inviting all the senior British officers, except Tarleton, to a party, a gesture of commonality among the officer class.
And yet, just 6 days later, he issued a very different kind of order.
A stark one. An order that all enslaved people who had fought with the British were to be rounded up and returned to their American owners.
To us, that seems like a profound betrayal of the ideals of liberty that had just been won.
It does. But we have to understand, it was not seen as bad behavior at the time. Washington was a slaveholder in a slave society. The sanctity of property rights was paramount. It's a deeply unsettling moment for the modern patriotic narrative, but it was the reality.
Yorktown was the end of the major fighting, but the war dragged on for 2 more years until the Treaty of Paris in 1783. Why the long delay?
Well, when the news of Yorktown reached London, it brought down Lord North's government. But the British still held New York, Charleston, Savannah, and the global conflict was still raging.
So they shifted focus.
They pivoted to securing their remaining assets. They won a major naval victory against the French in the Caribbean, the Battle of the Saints, which secured their Sugar Islands. They also broke the long siege of Gibraltar. They wanted to end the war on a high note.
When the peace treaty was finally negotiated, the British were surprisingly generous to the Americans.
Extremely generous, much more so than the French or Spanish wanted. The American delegation got almost everything they wanted, including vast territory up to the Mississippi River.
Why? Why would they be so generous to a defeated enemy?
It was pure strategy. History tells us the British wanted a reasonably strong United States. They saw it as a future bulwark against French or Spanish ambitions in North America.
So they were already thinking about the next war.
Precisely. The worst-case scenario for them was a weak, fragmented collection of states on the Atlantic coast. That would just invite more European meddling and threaten Canada. A stable, economically viable U.S. was, paradoxically, in Britain's long-term interest.
And the post-war relationship was surprisingly cordial, at least at first.
It was. You have that famous emotional meeting between John Adams, the first American minister, and King George III.
Where they both pledged future friendship.
Yes, based on common language, culture, religion. This idea that they were still fellow great Protestant powers with a common enemy in Catholic France. It was a very different reception than the Francophile Thomas Jefferson received later.
But this new United States was, internally, incredibly unstable.
Deeply so. It was just an uneasy confederation of 13 different states. The governing document, the Articles of Confederation, created an intentionally weak national government.
Because they were afraid of centralized tyranny, the very thing they fought against.
Of course. But it meant the government had no executive, no real power to make treaties, and critically, no power to tax. It could only ask the states for money.
Which didn't work well.
It didn't work at all. And this weakness led to crises like Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, where the national government was powerless to step in and restore order.
And this instability is what spurred the movement for a new constitution.
Yes, it alarmed figures like Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. They pushed for the Constitutional Convention of 1787 to create a much stronger national government.
With a much stronger executive. A president.
An elected monarch in some ways. The model for the presidency was based on a steward conception of kingship, giving the executive broad power to act in the nation's best interest. It was almost like a pre-Glorious Revolution English Constitution.
With the massive caveat that the president was elected.
The massive, crucial caveat. But this move created the fundamental political debate in American history.
Yeah.
The tension between the Federalists like Hamilton, who wanted a powerful central state, and the Anti-Federalists like Jefferson, who feared it and favored state autonomy. That tension has never gone away.
And the success of that powerful new executive model really depended entirely on the character of the first man to hold the office.
On George Washington. The whole war experience had given the country this hero, this focal point it desperately needed.
You've mentioned his antique Roman virtues, his willingness to put public good before private ambition.
Yes, his personality was the key contingent factor that steered the new nation towards stability. Think about it. The English Revolution produced a Cromwell. The French Revolution, a Napoleon. Both became dictators.
But Washington, after the war, went home.
He returned to Mount Vernon and his plow. King George himself said that if Washington did that, he would be the greatest man in history. That act established the tenor of the American presidency. It ensured the country would be a republic,
It was a critical moment.
a critical contingent moment. The nation was incredibly fortunate to have that specific man in that specific place at that specific time.
But today, that very foundation stone of the myth Washington's moral stature is being profoundly questioned because of his slave ownership.
It is. And there's a deep and justifiable discomfort with a foundation story built around these great white men, many of whom owned other human beings.
This has led to direct challenges like the 1619 Project.
A direct challenge. It seeks to replace 1776 with 1619, the date the first unfree Africans arrived in Virginia, as the nation's true founding moment.
Which creates a dilemma for the country, doesn't it? Does this critique improve our understanding of a complex past, or does it destabilize the origin myth so much that it damages the coherence of the republic itself?
That is the central question. And one specific claim that's emerged from this is that the defense of slavery was the principal reason for the revolution.
And you would say that's an overstatement.
I would say it's a great exaggeration. It's absolutely true that Southern slaveholders feared the British would use enslaved people against them. That happened. But to say that was the primary motivation for the entire revolution is not supported by the evidence.
The British anti-slavery movement wasn't yet strong enough in the 1770s to pose a real threat to their property if they'd stayed in the empire.
It wasn't. The fear was real, but it wasn't the existential threat it would become decades later. So if the American Republic is to survive, it needs an origin myth. But that myth has to evolve.
It has to incorporate the discomfort.
It has to find a way to honor the ringing principles of the Declaration of Independence, republicanism, popular participation, while also confronting the reality of the founders as enslavers. It's a difficult balance.
And this critique has a strange corollary, where the British Empire is sometimes cast as this great agent of abolitionism in 1776.
Which is, as you say, rather implausible. They would become that decades later. But during the war, offering freedom was a military tactic, not a moral crusade. The tension remains between the aspirational ideals of 1776 and the harsh realities established in 1619. A durable republic needs a story that can somehow hold both.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed learning something new. That's all for now, but in case you didn't notice, there are a lot more episodes on this subject available right now. If you're enjoying these historical podcasts, please like and subscribe and share with other history buffs.